Okay, today's lecture is on social movements and social change, which is chapter 21. I'm not going to start out talking about social movements, though. I'm actually going to start out talking about collective behavior, right, which is the first part of that chapter. I'll talk about what collective behavior is. There'll be at least 2, maybe 3 theories on collective behavior, and then we'll move on to social movements, talking about what social movements are, the scope of social movements, different types of social movements, some theory, and then we'll move on to framing, so how people discuss social problems and social issues when they're trying to change things about society through social movements. And then finally, there's just a little bit on social change at the very end. Okay? All right, let's get started then. Now, a social movement is like a group of people that are organized and they're striving to change something about society. But I want to start out talking about collective behavior, which is very different from that. Collective behavior is kind of a more spontaneous kind of behavior. You can kind of think of what happens when a crowd of people get together and sort of start spontaneously acting in unison in response to some kind of crazy situation or something like that. So collective behavior, again, it's not organized and it's not institutional, meaning that there's not any groups or institutions that are getting together to take part in this behavior. It's something that sort of happens naturally. So let me get a definition up on the board. Collective behavior is any non-institutionalized activity in which, several or a few or many people engage, right? And so again, non-institutional means it's not like mandated or regulated by any kind of institution. Again, it sort of happens spontaneously. Okay, now there's a lot of theory on collective behavior. Early theories on collective behavior kind of focused on the irrationality of crowds. So, and that's kind of obvious. When you look at crowd behavior, it seems like people are behaving irrationally. If you ask people who participate in a riot or something like that, what they were thinking, after the fact, they might say something like they got swept up in the crowd and everything was crazy, and they might have a difficult time rationalizing it based on their own beliefs, norms, values, right, etc. So early collective behavior theories focus on that irrationality, and it's kind of these theorists responding to the fact that it seems like when people are in crowds and get swept up in collective behavior, they don't really have any individual self-control, right? That there's some dynamic happening with crowds that makes people act irrationally. Durkheim coined the term collective effervescence, right, for this kind of sort of spontaneous, irrational crowd behavior, right? So like effervescent, like the word effervescent, you can think of like soda or whatever, like bubbling up. This kind of spontaneous bubbling up of crowd behavior, right? People getting carried away in the crowd or swept up with the crowd. And acting sort of in unison, right, or simultaneously, without there being too much individual rationality going on. So an example of something like that, this kind of collective effervescence, might be like what just happened with people panic hoarding toilet paper, right? It's completely irrational. I don't know, COVID and toilet paper really don't have anything to do with one another, right? It's not like a GI illness or something like that. It doesn't make any sense, right? But people sort of faced with COVID, faced with, maybe the prospect of being stuck at home for a while, panicked en masse, right? Acted simultaneously and behaved what looks like irrationally. However, if you go with later theories of collective behavior, those theories try to attach some kind of rationale to crowd behavior, right? So later theories of collective behavior are trying to make sense out of these seemingly irrational and spontaneous crowd behaviors and try to put some kind of rationale to them, try to figure out why people are doing what they're doing, right? So the first theory we could talk about that tries to, identify some kind of rationale in collective behavior is emergent norm theory. Right, emergent norm theory. So this is kind of the idea, and I'll put a definition on the board in a second, but this is kind of the idea that in a novel or abnormal or aberrant or bizarre situation, right, people kind of come in to the situation with their, standard set of norms. There's sort of normal norms, right? The normal social norms that govern us all on the day-to-day. But faced with this sort of unfolding, bizarre, situation, sometimes those old norms, our normal social norms, don't apply. And what happens is new norms sort of develop or emerge from the crowd. So that's why it's called emergent norm theory, right? So the idea that people go into crowd situations with their own, social norms, the sort of standard set of social norms. But as the situation develops, or you could say becomes more aberrant or abnormal, however you want to put it, the old norms don't seem to apply. The old norms no longer apply, and I hope this is all on video. I think the board is on there. So the old norms no longer apply, and new ones emerge, right? So new norms kind of come out of the crowd because the old norms are just not suited to handling this kind of weird situation, right? So, pre-COVID pandemic, right, it would be weird for all of us to run around from grocery store to grocery store buying as much toilet paper as we can wherever we can find it and hoarding toilet paper, right? I still think that's wrong. But it sort of, what happened in the situation is that people faced with this aberrant, abnormal, strange situation in which I think the day that it happened, there was some news about, possibly closing schools long term and people being stuck at home and stuff. So everyone ran out, right, to the grocery stores. And what happened was people saw, them running out of toilet paper at these grocery stores because a few people, I guess, thought because they were stuck at home they were going to need to have a lot of toilet paper. I don't know. And what happens is there's a kind of weird situation in which new norms emerge, right? And even the rational folk that weren't out for the original initial hoarding, right, that weren't in the grocery stores and stuff, even those rational folk are forced to go out and buy toilet paper because everybody's saying that the stores are running out and there won't be any, right, for a while. So, the old day-to-day norm that we don't usually go out and hoard toilet paper, that was out the window, and this new norm sort of emerged where, even for rational people, no one blamed them for going out and trying to buy toilet paper, which is, so again, the idea here is that it's not necessarily that people are behaving irrationally, though in my example, irrationality sparked this. It's that new norms sort of emerge in novel situations. The old example, before all this happened, and there's a lot of collective behavior going on right now, so I'm going to try to use COVID as an example for most of this stuff, but the old example I used was when they were doing construction on Route 40 a few years ago. I was stuck in really bad traffic they were like fixing the bridges and stuff, and it had to be a long time, like an hour or something like that. And traffic just was not moving, right? So people started to use the shoulder to create a lane out of the shoulder in order to get off at the next exit, right? Now normally, no one's going to use the shoulder of 40 as a lane and just drive down the shoulder of 40 like it's normal, right? That's against our day-to-day norms. But in that kind of abnormal situation, it made sense to do that and try to clear the road and get people off the exit. Moreover, I decided that if we're using the shoulder, the shoulder lane as an extra lane to get off the exit, why not create another lane and use the grass, right, on the side, on the far shoulder, as a lane as well. And as soon as I did that, everyone followed suit, right? And then we created 2 lanes to get off at the next exit. Now, I probably would have gotten a ticket if there was a cop at the other end. But still, the fact that people got on board meant that I sort of helped create this new norm, and a new norm emerged out of this weird situation, a norm, a rule that wouldn't apply on your day-to-day. So that's emergent norm theory and what it means. There's another theory that tries to make sense of sort of collective behavior that can seem irrational, and that is value-added theory. Value-added theory. And the reason it's called value-added theory is because there's a list of values, actually there's a list of conditions, right? And each time you add one of the conditions in the list, it makes collective behavior far more likely to happen, right? I don't have a ton of room to write these all down, but I'll try to explain them more than I write here. Okay, so there's value-added theory is just the idea that several conditions, which I'll talk about in a second, being met makes collective behavior more likely. It's also just like these conditions are also just kind of like a description of the process for how collective behavior often unfolds. Or you could also say they're like a pattern that collective behavior or collective behavior events often follow, at least. Okay, so the first of these conditions, let me move these over here actually. The first of these conditions is called structural conduciveness. Doesn't look right as far as the spelling, but I think that's right. Structural conduciveness, right? And so what that means is that there's some sort of situation or event that happens, and people are able, a crowd is able to form. People are able to gather around it. So something happens like in the street or something, and the situation is such that people notice this happening and they're able to form a crowd. They have the opportunity to gather in a crowd because of this situation, right? And by the way, this is all in the notes on Brightspace too. So if you don't get notes from the board, or like I'm not, completely defining all these, it'll be in the lecture notes on Brightspace. Okay, the second one is called structural strain. And what structural strain it means is that people's expectations regarding what should be happening given this situation, right, are unmet. Their expectations are unmet, meaning something is off, something is wrong, and it's creating tension or strain, which is why it's called structural strain, amongst people in the crowd, right? So it's creating some kind of stress or tension with people. And I'm going to give some examples to try to make sense of this process, right? Okay, number 3, the third condition is the growth and spread of a generalized belief. So the growth and spread of a generalized belief. So right now you have structural conduciveness, meaning there's some situation or event in which people are able to gather, right? Structural strain, meaning there's something off about the situation, people's expectations are unmet, there's tension in the crowd. And then third, you have this growth and spread of a generalized belief. So it could be anything. It could be a fact about what's actually happening in the situation, sort of circulating amongst the crowd. It could be some kind of rumor that's starting to spread amongst the crowd. But what it's doing is it's getting the entire crowd sort of on the same page as far as what they're thinking, right? So the growth and spread of a generalized belief. Okay. Number 4 is that there has to be some precipitating factor. I suppose there doesn't have to be, but this is a condition that if met, if there is some precipitating factor, then collective behavior is going to be even more likely. So a precipitating factor could be anything, but what it is something happening, something new happening that's sort of exacerbating or worsening the situation or sparking, right, a crowd that's already really tense. Rumors are spreading around. Everything's sort of bubbling up and ready to burst as far as collective behavior is concerned, right? So people are right on the edge. They're ready to do something. They're ready to act. They're ready to engage in some kind of collective action, collective behavior. And then something happens that really sparks that, right? And I'll give examples in a second to make sense of that. Okay, the 5th one is mobilization for action. Mobilization, right, for action. That means that leaders, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have leaders in the crowd, but basically the crowd somehow mobilizes to engage in collective behavior or some kind of action, whatever that may be, right? Typically, leaders emerge within the crowd. So within the crowd, you might have a few very vocal people, right? And they're shouting, let's do this or let's do that, right? And that sort of directs action. It sort of focuses people, right? People are already on the same page as far as their beliefs and thoughts because of the spread of the generalized belief. But that mobilization for action is, some vocal people in the crowd telling the crowd what they ought to do, right? Even if it's someone screaming, let's get them or something, and it's very irrational, it's still sort of mobilizing action. And then finally, this isn't actually the collective behavior, it's the end of the collective behavior, is when the authorities step in, right, or some kind of authority steps in and puts a stop to the collective behavior. So number 6 we'll call social control, right? Some form of authority puts an end to the group action via some kind of social control, whatever that is. So let's see, can we use the toilet paper hoarding example? I think I did in the notes. So in the toilet paper example, we can kind of run through this pattern with that too, I think. So there's structural conduciveness. So people, I can't remember what day that was that happened. It was a couple weeks ago, right? People hear, right, that there's this situation developing. Obviously, the COVID pandemic is happening, right? But people hear, I can't remember if it was schools were being closed, or what the initial, or maybe, was it when Knox County announced that it was going to start closing business down, like non-essential ones? I can't remember what it was. But in any case, people found out basically that they were probably going to be stuck at home for a long time, right? And everyone sort of that day rushed to the grocery store. Everyone's been rushing to the grocery store every day since, but that was like the first day, right? So that's the structural conduciveness. There's a situation happening and people can gather in crowds. They're all sort of going to the grocery store en masse, right? Then there's structural strain, right? People are hoarding things like toilet paper, right? And so when others get to the store, they find that there are limited supplies, or maybe the store is already out of stock as far as toilet paper goes. So their normal day-to-day expectations about what they can find in the grocery store are unmet, right? They also don't see maybe people who work in the grocery store bringing out more, right? So those expectations are unmet. People are tense, people are stressed. That's the structural strain. The growth and spread of a generalized belief, that day I was getting phone calls from people saying, hey, you better get to the grocery store or you're not going to have toilet paper. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? But these beliefs were spreading, and you can think about different stores running out of toilet paper and people, amongst themselves and through phone calls and stuff saying everybody's running out, there's not going to be any, right? This is in everybody's head, that there's going to be this shortage or that there's not any in the stores. And so everybody's sort of on the same page as far as this belief, and that's the growth and spread of a generalized belief, whether true or not, right? Whether the stores at the time were actually saying, or managers of the stores were actually saying, we're going to be completely out, that's sort of beside the point. As long as everybody is sort of believing this, it doesn't matter whether it's true or false. Precipitating factor, the precipitating factor could be, more emails about closure. It could be stores actually running out of supplies or saying they've run out of supplies. It could be anything. It just something else, like adding to the situation just to exacerbate it a little bit, right? Sparks people to freak out. So everybody, thinks people are running out of toilet paper. There's that initial thought of people going to the stores. Then there's this precipitating factor. Something else happens, right? Now, mobilization for action doesn't make as much sense in this particular instance, but essentially people did mobilize and act sort of simultaneously or in unison because everybody started to go out and buy up toilet paper until there really wasn't anything left, right? And we've been in this situation for weeks where you basically have to go to the store at like 5 in the morning when they first put things out, and they're limiting how much people can get and everything because of this action that happened, right? And so that's the kind of the social control. So there's not like, it doesn't have to be police or any kind of authority like that. Basically, the stores kind of stepped in and said, okay, listen, we can't have this continue to happen, so they're limiting the amount that each customer can buy. They're only putting a set amount of stock out every day in order to sort of spread out how fast we go through their supply and things like that. So that would be the social control. All right, the old example I used to use for value-added theory, and you can apply this pattern to so many different kinds or different collective behavior events. It's really pretty a pretty elegant pattern because it fits so many different kinds of things. There was that episode of Twilight Zone about something on Maple Street where everybody's kind of like things keep happening and everybody thinks it's like aliens invading, and it sort of just like spirals out. It follows this exact pattern if you go and watch it or read it. So there are all kinds of different ones. The one I used to use was like a shooting, right? So a police shooting, right? So, or police, who knows? Like a shooting happens, right? So structural conduciveness, let's just say, this is all hypothetical, but let's just say there's a kid who's shot and he's lying in the street, right? And you have people coming out of their houses and apartments and stuff to see what happened. And so that's structural conduciveness, right? Meaning something happens, someone's shot, and a bunch of people can gather. That's the structural conduciveness. Now let's say that police are, standing over this person that's shot, and the ambulances are on their way, but they're not there yet. That could cause tension, right? Structural strain, in which people see police standing over someone who's been shot, right? But they don't see any ambulances around. They don't see the person being helped all that well. That can make people tense because that's not our expectation. Our expectation is when someone gets hurt, someone calls 911, paramedics are on the scene, and things are, people are trying to help. So if no one's helping, that could cause that structural strain or tension, right? Now, the spread of a generalized belief. Let's say in this hypothetical scenario, we just came out of our house and gathered with the crowd, so we have no idea what happened, right? We just know that we heard shots and there's someone lying in the street and police standing over them, right? So maybe the police got there after the fact, maybe the police shot the person, who knows what happened, doesn't matter, right? The spread of a generalized belief just means something. Someone has to say something that makes its way around that crowd so that everybody's head is on the same page, right? So maybe someone says, the police just shot that unarmed kid, right? Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true, maybe it's a rumor, it doesn't matter. That spreads around the crowd, right? So the crowd gathers, they're not seeing, the person who was shot being helped. They believe now that the police shot this person and the person's unarmed, right? Now, precipitating factor, and this is often a precipitating factor in conflicts and riots and conflicts with police and stuff like that, is that more police show up, right? And this is often the case when you have a crowd gathered, especially a crowd that's sort of, ripe for collective action and tense and things like that, is that more police show up to push people back and calm people down and stuff like that. But often that has the opposite effect. That's the precipitating factor, right? People already think the police might have been involved in the shooting and they might be angry. And then when more police show up, right, to try to push back the line and stuff, that could be the precipitating factor that makes people angry. Mobilization for action. Maybe someone gets in an altercation with the police and tries to get other people to back them up. Before you know it, you could have a full-blown riot on your hands, right? Or the police could, right? And then they have to create some kind of social control, meaning they have to step in with riot police and stuff and stop the crowd from being in physical conflict with police or whatever the crowd is doing, right? And I'm not to say that the crowd is right or wrong in that instance, and we don't even know the full facts about it, this hypothetical, but that is a good, I think, example of how this pattern plays out with respect to collective behavior. Now, getting back to what we were saying originally, is that an irrational crowd or a rational crowd? I think value-added theory shows pretty well that you can have an overall rational people in a crowd responding to things like this generalized belief. Now, maybe it's not fully rational to believe, right, the generalized belief, but if you believe something to be true, right, and everyone else in the crowd believes it to be true, then acting on that, right, and acting on these precipitating factors is not necessarily just acting completely irrationally, right? There's some reason, there's some motivation behind the collective behavior at least. All right, I think that's it for collective behavior. Let me just check my notes real quick. Yeah, let's move on then to actually talking about social movements, which is the title of the chapter. So let's talk about social movements. So a social movement is any purposeful, organized. See, it already sounds very different from collective behavior. Any purposeful, organized group, or it could be groups too. A social movement could be made up of different organizations, but any purposeful, organized group or groups that strives to change something about society, or you could say the social structure, right? So trying to change some aspect of society or the social structure, right? Trying to create some kind of progressive change in society. That's what a social movement is, and they're striving, right, towards this goal. And these could literally be at any level as far as scope, right? So you could have a social movement that's very localized at the local level. It could be at the community level. It could even be a social movement on a single college campus. Maybe there's something very particular about how the college is structured, or there's some problematic policy that students are seeing, in the college or something like that, or there's something wrong about the climate and how people are interacting at the college, whatever. You could have a very localized movement as far as a social movement. Or you could have, social movements at a state level if you're trying to change some kind of state law or something like that. You could obviously have social movements at the national level. Maybe you're trying to get some kind of legislation passed at the national level, or maybe you're trying to get, advocate for someone for the Supreme Court or a certain Supreme Court decision, trying to get that passed, right? And then also you could have, obviously, social movements at the global level where you have multiple nations involved. You might have NGOs or something working on trying to fix some big problem at the global level, whether it's, climate change or global poverty, or working on trying to fix the global feminization of poverty, stuff like that, right? So social movements, the scope can be pretty much anything, and they're purposeful, they're organized groups, and they're striving to change something about society, right? Now, there can be different types of social movements depending on what it is the social movement is trying to change about society, and also to what extent, like how much that social movement is trying to change. So types of social movements vary by what each is trying to change about society or accomplish, and I'll just say to what extent. Okay? So as far as types of social movements, they vary by what they're trying to do, essentially. The first type I want to talk about are reform movements, right? So a reform movement is a type of social movement that is trying to change some specific aspect. So seeks to change some specific aspect of the social structure, right, of maybe a certain institution or of society in general. It's trying to change something specific. When we talk about reform movements, when we talk about social movements, most social movements, yeah, I think I'm safe in saying most social movements are reform movements, meaning all the progressive social movements we could think of. I mean, the quintessential social movement obviously being the civil rights movement, right? Trying to achieve racial equality in the U.S., right? They were trying to change some specific aspect of society, right? So the civil rights movement was obviously trying to fix racial inequality. Now that involved a lot of different institutions. It involved, housing and the economy and the criminal justice. It involved all kinds of different legislation that needed to be corrected. But it was trying to change something specific, right? That racial inequality. So some specific aspect, or the movement today to try to have some system of universal health care in the United States, that would be a reform movement because it's trying to change something specific, again, about the social structure of society, namely how we do healthcare, right? So that's a reform movement, trying to be some kind of progressive movement, trying to reform something about society. As opposed to, say, a revolutionary movement, which seeks to change pretty much everything about society, seeks to change nearly all aspects of society, right? So, and a good example of like a revolutionary movement that was, I won't say successful because millions of people died, but that happened, right, would be the Communist Revolution in China and Mao's China, right? That was a revolutionary movement because it sought and did change nearly every aspect of Chinese society. So it changed the economy, it changed how agriculture worked, it changed what employment looked like, it changed religion, right? It banned certain religious practices. It changed it overhauled the culture completely. That's a revolutionary movement. And other counterculture movements within the United States, like even the hippie movement in the 60s, those, hippies in the 1960s rejected pretty much every aspect of 1950s culture. So they rejected, capitalist consumerism. They rejected conservative values. They rejected views about sex, about drugs, all kinds of stuff, right? So the more the movement rejects and wants to change, the more it's a revolutionary movement as opposed to a reform movement that's just trying to change one, or reform, or have a progressive change in one aspect. Okay, so that's reform and revolutionary. There are a few more, but I ran out of board space here, so I'm going to erase this. I guess I'll go back up here. So those are the big ones, other than, I guess I'll do resistance next, because that's the other big one that we see a lot. Resistance movements. Now, whether or not your movement counts as a resistance movement or a reform movement kind of depends on what side you're on sometimes, how you frame it, and I'll talk about framing in a little while. But we can kind of define resistance movements as movements that seek to prevent or undo progressive change, the progressive change that reform movements want, right? So resistance movements seek to prevent or reverse, undo progressive social changes, right? Seek to prevent or undo progressive social changes, right? So a good example of a resistance movement would be the pro-life movement, because they're trying to reverse or undo Roe v. Wade, right? Making abortion illegal, right? Or the gun rights movement might also be seen as a resistance movement, because they're trying to prevent further legislation, further gun control legislation, right? They're trying to prevent that arguably reform kind of progressive change to society. So that's the resistance movement. A couple other movements are religious/redemptive, and alternative. So religious, redemptive, and alternative. Religious movements are, evangelizing movements, right, that seek to convert people, or let's say, or change people, obviously religiously or spiritually, or however you want to put it, right? So religions that proselytize, like evangelical Christianity, they're out there trying to convert people. That would be a religious redemptive social movement. Alternative social movement are movements that are pretty limited in their scope. They seek to change some specific aspect of people's behavior. Sorry, let me say individuals' behavior. And if you can't read this, because I'm getting kind of close to the bottom, again, it's in the notes on Brightspace. So alternative movements seek to change some specific aspect of individuals' behavior or beliefs, right? An alternative movement. I don't know if it would make vegans mad to call veganism an alternative movement, but I think that's probably a pretty good example of an alternative movement. They're seeking to change people's diet, or the way. A lot of these alternative movements seek to change what people consume in our consumer society, or it could be anything. It could be a movement to change how people, work out, or how, to get people to meditate, or whatever, right? These sort of kind of more fringe movements. They're not seeking to change something about the social structure. They're seeking to change just one aspect of how individuals live their day-to-day. Okay, so those are the types of social movements. Next, I want to talk about the stages of social movements. Then we'll talk about a little bit of theory, and we'll move on. So the stages of social movements, right? Okay, so social movements tend to go through 4 stages. The first is the preliminary stage. This is when, do I say that much when I'm actually lecturing, or is it just when I'm filming it? I can't stop saying it. Okay. The first is the preliminary stage. That's when people first start to become aware of some social problem or issue, whatever the movement is eventually going to try to change about society, or correct, or have a progressive plan for. So the first preliminary stage is just that people become aware of an issue or social problem. People are just starting to notice, to pay attention to what's happening, this issue, this problem. The second stage is called coalescence. And the word coalescence basically means to come together, right? So people start to come together to spread awareness, right? To publicize the issue, to spread awareness. And leaders emerge, right? At this stage, you get people joining grassroots, like kind of volunteer efforts to do something about this social issue, right? Leaders emerge within these grassroots efforts, and they're trying to spread awareness and publicize, maybe start to raise money, and do something real about the issue. So at this stage, this coalescence means essentially that the movement really starts to gel. Movement gels, right? So these are the first two stages when things first start happening. And these stages are kind of facilitated today more so than ever by social media, right? Like you could see how social media makes this preliminary stage especially a lot easier, because it's easier to kind of spread awareness. Now, it might end with that, right? Just the awareness spreading. That's the problem, I think, with social media, is it only goes that far, and then people don't really get on board and do anything real, because all they've done is like something or repost something, and that doesn't do anything for anyone, right? But they think they've done something, and so they stop caring about the issue, or they stop focusing on the issue because they feel like, well, I already did my part, kind of thing. But it is easy to get this preliminary stage going, because it is a lot easier to spread awareness about an issue. So that helps with the preliminary stage. It can even help with coalescence a little bit. The third stage is when the movement has really gotten going, and you've got this social movement organization, which I'll talk about the different sort of levels in a minute. But that's the stage when the movement is institutionalized. So the third stage is the institutionalized stage, right? That's when you have an organized movement that no longer requires grassroots volunteers, right? An organized movement that no longer requires grassroots volunteers. They often have a paid staff, right? They're a full-on bureaucratic organization, or even, a bunch of different organizations, right? So institutionalized stage, there might still be grassroots volunteers involved at the institutionalized stage. You could think of even a campaign, right? A political campaign going through these stages. By the time it gets to this stage, this campaign has paid staffers and stuff, but they also use grassroots volunteers. So they can still use grassroots volunteers. It's just they don't have to rely on that, because they're a fully functioning social movement organization by this point. Okay, so that's the third stage. That's when everything's chugging along. And now the final stage is decline, right? Some social movements seem to just keep going and going because nothing changes. Like the pro-life movement, right? Unless Roe v. Wade ever gets overturned, they've just keep hammering away at the same thing, right, for decades. But most social movements face the fourth stage, which is decline. A number of things can lead to the decline, well, actually, three main ones can lead to the decline of a social movement, right? So either the movement achieves, this is the best case scenario, right? The movement achieves its primary goal and becomes obsolete, right? It's no longer needed because it achieved its goal. Or sometimes movements can pivot, change their goal completely because they've already accomplished the goal they started with, right? So sometimes movements decline because they get what they wanted, right? For instance, now it's part of the larger LGBTQIA plus movement, right? But marriage equality, right, was its own separate social movement, striving for the federal government to recognize gay marriages, right? So if you were involved in that marriage equality movement, suddenly when that Supreme Court decision happened in June of 2015, your movement's got nothing to do. You did it. You accomplished what you wanted to do. So if you're working for a group, right, that was striving towards marriage equality, then you have to pivot. Then you have to take your resources and your people and start working on something else. Start trying to change something else because you've achieved your goal. You're now obsolete, right? So that's best case scenario. Either the movement achieves its primary goal and becomes obsolete, or it's kind of defeated by a competing movement, right? Now, a lot of social movements, especially reform movements, have competing resistance movements and vice versa, right? So we can think about these, gun control versus gun rights, pro-life versus pro-choice, et cetera, right? So a lot of social movements have competing social movements with the opposite kinds of goals, right? So when a movement declines, either it could get what it was trying to get and be obsolete, or it could be defeated by some competing social movement, right? The competing movement manages to win the hearts and minds of the people in the nation, and they really that movement really ends up losing traction because the competing movement wins out. Or finally, people might just stop caring about the issue altogether. So people stop caring, right? You're tirelessly working on a social movement issue, like in a social movement, on trying to change something about society. And it's not that the competing movement wins, it's just that everyone in society just kind of stops caring about the issue, and you can't spread awareness anymore because no one cares, right? So that's the last thing that can happen as far as the decline of the social movement. Maybe, people stop caring about the issue because it's not really as big an issue anymore or whatever. So those are the 4 stages that most social movements move through. And you can kind of get stuck in any one of those stages and not, be able to make it all the way through all 4. Okay, the one theory I want to talk about with respect to social movements is very straightforward, and it's called resource mobilization theory. And this is just the idea that the success of a social movement, of some given social movement, depends on its ability to mobilize resources. In other words, to I'll say mobilize resources. In other words, basically to garner people's awareness, right? To make people care, their time, to get people involved, right? their effort, and money, right? So to get, right, people's essentially their time and money, right? You want to acquire those resources, that effort from people, that awareness from people, and make people donate to your cause, right? So the better you could do that, and this is, goes without saying almost, it's obvious, the better your movement is going to do. Really quickly, I just wanted to kind of show you what this looks like, right? So when you interact with the social movement, say you give money to some particular cause or something like that, you're typically interacting with a social movement organization, right? A social movement organization, right? Which is a particular group. Some organized group working toward some particular social goal, right? So there's some particular group trying to change something pretty specific about society. They have a pretty specific goal, right? So that's kind of like who we would interact with if we were interacting with a social movement. We would be interacting with some group, some social movement organization. And within a social movement, a larger social movement, there's a lot of these social movement organizations all kind of working towards the same kind of stuff. So I'll call those SMOs, social movement organizations, and there's a lot of them, right? Now, each of those falls under a kind of larger umbrella that we could call a social movement industry. So it falls under the social movement industry, right? And what that is the social movement industry. There's more than one of these too, right? That's a collection. The social movement industry is a collection of social movement organizations with similar goals, right? So you might have a bunch of different social movement organizations trying to help provide health care for the poor, right? And that all kind of falls under the social movement industry of universal health care, something like that, right? Or you could have a bunch of social movement organizations working on different things like housing equality or Black Lives Matter, things like that, and they would fall under the social movement industry of like racial and ethnic equality or something like that, right? You get the idea, right? So there are different social movement organizations. There's lots of those, and then they fall under these sort of social movement industries where, like the environmentalist movement, that's another social movement industry, trying to change climate change with a bunch of different social movement organizations doing stuff right under that umbrella. And then those all together make up what we call the social movement sector, right? The big social movement sector that contains all this stuff, all these progressive movements and social movement industries, right? Now, if you go back to like the early 20th century, there's not much falling under this social movement sector, right? We have a massive social movement sector, a massive nonprofit progressive sector now, with lots of different organizations doing lots of different things under lots of different social movement industries, right? But if you go back to the early 20th century, it was like the women's movement, like progressive, like you think of like the bunch of progressive era movements of the 1920s and stuff that were led by women. Women's before that, women's suffrage, right? So there was like the women's movements and the labor movement, right? Trying to unionize and get like pro-labor legislation passed and stuff like that. So there wasn't that much happening in the social movement sector. But over the course of the 20th century, I mean, the social movement sector just explodes with all kinds of different social movement industries. And obviously, the big one being in the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement, right, for racial equality. That was a huge... Now, even before we had something called the civil rights movement, like as you could call that a social movement industry that had different organizations, like the Southern Christian Law Conference and SNCC and all those different organizations headed by, run by different people like Stokely Carmichael and obviously MLK and stuff like that. Before we had the civil rights movement and those social movement organizations, there were sort of social movement organizations like the NAACP that existed prior to that. But the civil rights movement became this massive social movement industry that prompted the sort of creation of a lot more social movement organizations. So even if Rosa Parks was a member of the NAACP before she was involved in the civil rights movement, that's when you see a lot of the social movement organizations start to coalesce because they're bolstered by that civil rights movement. That also helped spark the women's rights movement and all kinds of different things after that. But I was using the term social movement organization earlier, so I just wanted to kind of explain what I meant by that. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is framing. And this is something that all social movements use, framing or frames, in order to talk about and spread awareness about the social issue or problem that they're trying to address, or about what they're trying to change about society or the social structure. It's more than just social movements, right? Politicians constantly are using framing. It happens in business and advertising and consumerism. It happens everywhere. But for our purposes, we're using it as a sociological concept. So framing or frames is just a broad sociological concept for how people talk about and understand, right, some issues. So how people, let's say, identify and understand social problems or issues. A broad sociological concept for how people identify and understand social problems or issues, as well as what norms ought to apply to those issues or regarding those issues. What norms we ought to follow with respect to those issues. So what norms ought to apply to those issues, right? That's framing. So there are three types of frames that I want to talk about that successful social movements use to their benefit, right? And politicians and everyone else, right? The media, etc., right? There's three different types of framing that are used, but especially when talking about a social problem or some social issue that you're advocating to change in society, right? The first is diagnostic frames or diagnostic framing. Let's say your movement, right, and the people that you spread awareness to, and the as the movement coalesces and gels, there's something specific you want to change in society, you have to have a good diagnostic frame. And that's stating what you think is the problem, the social problem or issue, in a clear, easily understood way. Right? So diagnostic, you're diagnosing the problem, saying what the problem is in a clear and easily understood way. You're identifying the social problem or issue, what you want to change, right? Diagnostic framing, stating the problem in a clear and easily understood way. You want to state it as simplistically as possible because you're trying to reach as many people as you can as far as spreading awareness, right? You're talking to the lowest common denominator of the general public, and so you want to keep it as simple as possible. For good or ill, for good or ill, right? Trump is very good at diagnostic framing. He speaks in the, everything is tremendous or whatever, but like he speaks in very clear and simple ways so that he can try to get the message that he wants to get out to people to everyone, right? Through diagnostic framing, through saying exactly, identifying what the issue is, right? In the words that he wants people to think of it in a very simplistic way. All right, but any good social movement is going to do that too. They're going to frame things in a way that's easily understood. And I'll give some examples in a second when I get all three of these down. The second is prognostic framing. You can think of like diagnosis and prognosis. It's a little bit different. Prognosis, it's just kind of the same, like what's going to happen going forward, right? So the prognostic frame offers... Also, the prognostic frame should be clear and easily understood too, but it offers a solution, right? Whatever your social movement thinks is the solution to the problem, a solution to the problem, and how that solution is going to be implemented. So I'm just saying how implemented. Shorthand there. Okay. So prognostic framing offers a solution to the problem and how it will be implemented. And then finally, motivational framing, I will say, is a call to action. Motivational framing tells people, is the movement or whoever telling people what they can do to get involved, what they can do to help, right? So motivational framing could be, vote yes on such and such proposition or vote no on such and such proposition. Vote for such and such a candidate. Please boycott such and such a business or corporation. Please, take part in this march that we're going to have. Whatever it is, it's a call to action. It's something very specific. Please don't use plastic drinking straws. Whatever, right? It's a call to action. It's anything that individuals can do to get involved, right? And it's usually pretty specific. So successful social, or donate money to this cause or whatever. Successful social movements do all three of these really well. In fact, you have to do all three of these really well to be a successful social movement. It might help to think of like framing in terms of competing social movements, and then we can kind of see how they work, right? So competing social movement, I mentioned like gun violence earlier, if that's the problem that we want to talk about. Then you have two competing movements. You have the gun control movement versus the gun rights movement. Now, you already have the diagnostic frame in the names of the movement. That's how simplistic it needs to be, right? Gun control. You're trying to control guns, right? Gun violence is the problem for gun control advocates, right? So their kind of diagnostic frame is right in their name. We need to control, right, firearms in this country. How many firearms there are, who has them, whatever. Gun control, right in the name. Gun rights. You can see that totally shifts what we're talking about, right? We were talking about the problem of all this proliferation of firearms and how dangerous it is in the country. All of a sudden, we're talking about rights. So by framing it as a rights issue, they've completely reframed the debate. What we're talking about? No, we're not talking about controlling these things. We're talking about our rights, right? Our constitutional rights. So they reframe it, and that's why you have such. It's bizarre in this country how attached we are to our guns, but that's why you have these movements at such a sort of an impasse, right? Because they have very different frames and they reach people in very different ways. Now, if you're going to stick with that, those competing movements, you can get to the prognostic frames, right? The gun control people, their solution is legislation, so increased gun legislation, either gun bans, well, not necessarily bans, but like cutting back on the amount of weapons the public has access to, the kinds of weapons, whatever, right? You know that it's typically legislation is what they're pushing. The gun rights movement is a sort of resistance movement, and they're trying, they frame it as a rights thing, so they see any kind of gun legislation, which is the prognostic frame of the gun control group, as an infringement or an erosion of constitutional rights or something like that. So that's how they frame it. Preventing that legislation, voting for people who are preventing that legislation, joining the NRA might be one of their calls to action, stuff like that, right? So we can see how these two competing social movements use frames, right, very differently, but each does so fairly successfully as well. All right, now there's lots more that I could talk about with respect to framing, but these are the main important ones. But there are other aspects of framing that social movements can do, especially struggling social movements. So there's something called bridging, in which two social movements join together, right? So if you have two struggling, say, social movement organizations, usually, they can sort of pool their resources and join together and work together. There's amplification, which means you sort of amplify what your goals are. You sort of broaden what your goals are to reach more people. So if you have very narrow goals, maybe not that many people are interested in achieving those goals, but if you sort of broaden them to reach other audiences that care about other things, you might reach more people and be able to generate that, resource mobilization stuff, right? So that's amplification. There's also extension, in which two different social movements or social movement organizations agree to promote one another. Let's say they have sort of similar interests, or at least their interests and goals are not in conflict. They might agree to promote one another through their social media or whatever means they have of reaching the public. And then finally, and I kind of mentioned it when I talked about decline, is transformation. If you're a struggling social movement or social movement organization, you might have to pivot. You might have to change your goal. You might have to change, your prognostic frame or something like that in order to stay alive, to reach more people, to keep generating resources, etc. Okay, so that's framing. We're almost done, and we're at, I don't know, an hour and 15 minutes almost, or something like that. I can't see it, but this is usually it probably takes me 2 lectures to do this, so I'm moving pretty quickly. The last thing I want to talk about is the last part of the chapter title, which is social change, right? How we get change in society, how we change the social structure. Now, the whole thing I've been talking about, for more than half this lecture is social movements, and that's a real way to achieve social change. So that's what we've already talked about as far as social change goes. That's really hard. That's like bottom up. You have to get the people at the micro level in society involved in shifting society, right? Either changing something fundamental about the structure of society or one of its institutions, or changing the culture of society it's very difficult to do that, for a society to sort of self-reflect, right, and decide, okay, we're gonna all get in this together and change society sort of from the bottom up. That's very difficult, but it's, it happens. The civil rights movement happened, thankfully. It's sort of an ongoing process, but we can change society progressively and for the better through social movements. But there are other ways that society changes. I think I have maybe 4 that I want to discuss. Yeah, so one way that society changes is through technology, or I'll say technological innovation. And I think I already talked about this way back in a lecture about, I don't know, the lectures on society maybe, or the lecture on culture, because I was probably talking about material culture, right? So one way society can change is a change in material culture through technological innovation, right? It's far easier to change material culture, to give people a new thing, than it is to change people's beliefs, values, norms, behaviors, right? It's easier to just, like I said, getting digital tech and cell phones has changed almost every aspect of our culture and how we communicate with each other socially. So that precedes a lot of change, or precipitates a lot of change. So technological innovation in agriculture, responsible for the agricultural revolution, changed every institution in society. The Industrial Revolution and the technological innovation that sparked the Industrial Revolution changed every aspect of society, right? Economy, family, everything. So that's a big way that social change is precipitated. Another is institutional change. And what I mean by that is a change in one institution, right? If you think about sort of a functionalist view of society, that being these interrelated parts, these institutions that function together, a change in one institution usually leads to a change in the others, or in others. I'll just say a change in one institution changes others, meaning other institutions, right? So anytime you have a change in the economy, for instance, it's going to change other kinds of institutions. The Industrial Revolution, right? That's sort of an economic, technological change in how production, manufacturing, what people do for work, employment. That changed another completely separate institution, the family, because people started having fewer children. So family size shrunk considerably, because you need a lot of children to help you when you're in an agricultural society, but when you're in an industrial society, or like we now live in this sort of information society, this digital tech society, children are expensive, and you know, people have fewer of them, right? Okay, so a change in one institution usually precipitates a change in the other. The third is population, right? Right? So the population itself, the demographics of the population can cause social change. Right now, for instance, we're dealing with the aging baby boomer population, and that's going to change a lot. It's going to affect our economy. It's going to affect our families and how we care for our elders, right? It's going to affect our healthcare system, Social Security, how we do social welfare, you name it. It's going to affect a lot. So population can also have a big impact. If you have a lot of really young people in society, that also changes how the society is structured. Okay, and then the final one to mention as far as social change is environment, right? And I mean like the physical environment. And basically with environment, the more we impact the environment, the more impact it's going to have on us down the line, because we're going to have to adapt to these sort of changes and environmental problems and climate change and all that, right? So that is social change. All right, that is it for chapter 21 on social movements and social change. I'm going to try to upload this so you have it. Today's Tuesday, so you have it tomorrow, Wednesday, and I will see you in the next group chat. Oh, also, thanks for joining the group chats. I think it's working really well. It's a good way to make sure I'm communicating with everyone. It's a good way to take attendance. So thanks for showing up to those.